Sarah and Michael Miller seemed to have it all. On the outside, they were the picture of a perfect couple, successful, happy, and deeply in love. They lived in a beautiful suburban home with 2 young children, and their life appeared to be the envy of everyone who knew them. Michael, a high-powered businessman, was well respected in the community. Sarah, a stay-at-home mother, dedicated herself to raising their children and keeping their home in perfect order. Friends and family often commented on how lucky they were, how their relationship seemed flawless, and how they made it all look so easy. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. At first, Sarah didn't notice the small changes. Michael had always worked long hours, but lately, it felt like he was away even more often. He'd come home late, claiming he was tied up at meetings or dealing with business emergencies. Sarah, ever the supportive wife, made excuses for him. His job was demanding, after all, and she wanted to believe that he was just caught up in the responsibilities of his career. Then came the subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. Michael would rush out of the house in the mornings, texting furiously as he got into the car. Sometimes, he'd leave his phone unattended, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the odd texts and the cryptic messages that seemed to pop up on the screen. When she asked about it, he would dismiss her concerns, brushing it off with a smile and a quick reassurance that it was just work-related. But Sarah's intuition told her something was off. It wasn't until she stumbled across an unfamiliar number in Michael's phone one evening that the pieces started to fall into place. The number belonged to a woman, someone Sarah didn't recognize, someone who seemed to be texting Michael more and more frequently. As the messages grew more intimate and personal, Sarah felt her stomach twist with a feeling of dread. This wasn't just work talk. This was something else. Something she couldn't ignore any longer. Her heart sank as she pieced together the truth. Michael had been having an affair. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The man she had married, the father of her children, the one person she had trusted above all else, had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. It wasn't just the affair that devastated her, it was the years of lies, the deceit, the fact that her entire life had been built on a foundation of falsehoods. She had loved him, trusted him, and believed in him, and yet, he had been living a double life. The anger was the first emotion that hit her. It burned through her, hot and consuming, as she thought about the hurt Michael had caused. But then came the overwhelming sense of betrayal, the quiet ache in her chest that she could never have prepared for. She spent the next few days in a fog, her mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't she seen the signs? Why hadn't he been honest with her? The more Sarah thought about it, the more her feelings of rage turned to thoughts of revenge. Michael's betrayal wasn't something she could simply ignore. She wanted him to feel the same pain, the same loss, that she now carried with her. She had been a devoted wife, a loving mother, and all of it meant nothing to him. What kind of man would do this? What kind of man would shatter the life they had built together for something as selfish as an affair? In the quiet of her home, Sarah began to plan. It wasn't just about confronting him anymore. She wanted justice. She wanted payback. She wanted Michael to feel what she felt. But this wouldn't be a quick confrontation, no, this would be something far more calculated. Something no one would expect. As the days passed, Sarah's mind became consumed with thoughts of revenge. The initial shock and heartbreak gave way to a cold, calculating determination. She knew that confronting Michael directly wouldn't give her the satisfaction she needed. She didn't want a mere argument, she wanted to make him pay in a way that would haunt him forever. The anger inside her was now intertwined with a chilling calmness, a sense of control that felt both empowering and terrifying. At first, Sarah did what she had always done, play the part of the loving wife. She continued to cook his favorite meals, greet him with a smile when he came home, and tend to the children as if everything were perfectly normal. She was a master at hiding her emotions, at keeping the facade of a happy family intact. Michael, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind, continued with his routine, making no effort to hide his affair or the fact that he had no intention of ending it. He believed Sarah would never confront him, that she would continue to turn a blind eye as she had done before. But Sarah was no fool. She knew exactly what he was doing, and that only fueled her resolve. Each night, after Michael had gone to bed, Sarah would lie awake, thinking about the betrayal. The idea of confronting him was tempting. She could yell, accuse him, demand answers, but she knew that would only make her look weak. Michael wasn't the kind of man who would admit fault easily. He would lie, deny, and twist the situation until he could make her feel like she was the one in the wrong. No, she couldn't afford to let him have the upper hand. Her revenge would be more precise, more calculated. She would make sure he would never see it coming. She began to observe him more closely, paying attention to the smallest details, his routines, his habits, the places he frequented, and the people he spoke to. She memorized the names of his colleagues and business partners, studied his work schedule, and kept track of the times he left for meetings and business trips. Sarah also knew that, just like many men who are unfaithful, Michael would start to grow complacent, believing that his affair was hidden well enough. He would let his guard down, and that's when she would strike. The weeks dragged on as Sarah carefully put her plan into motion. She wasn't just preparing for a confrontation, she was preparing for something far darker. Michael had always taken for granted that Sarah would never do anything drastic. He trusted her too much, assuming that she would never go beyond the boundaries of what he had conditioned her to accept. But what he didn't know was that Sarah had already crossed a line. She was no longer the trusting, loving wife. She was someone else, someone far more dangerous. The more she observed Michael, the more she found herself disgusted by his arrogance. He acted as though he had everything under control. He didn't seem to care about the hurt he had caused, or the fact that Sarah had caught him in the act. He continued with his affair without a second thought, further fueling her desire for revenge. Michael's indifference to her pain was the final straw. Sarah realized that no matter how much she hurt, no matter how much she suffered, Michael would never truly understand what he had done to her. But she would make him understand. She would make him regret every lie, every deceitful word, and every moment he thought he could get away with his betrayal. By now, Sarah had everything planned out. The weapon was ready, hidden in a place Michael would never think to look. The perfect time would come soon enough. Sarah knew exactly when Michael would be the most vulnerable, when he would drop his guard, and that's when she would execute her plan. There would be no turning back. There could be no hesitation. Sarah's mind was set. This was her chance to reclaim control, to make Michael pay for what he had done, and she was ready. The night of Michael's death arrived with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Sarah had spent weeks preparing, ensuring every detail was accounted for. Her plan was as carefully constructed as a puzzle, and tonight, it would fall into place. Michael had no idea what was coming. He had been out most of the day on business, and when he returned home late in the evening, he was exhausted, distracted by the pressures of his career and the affair he thought no one knew about. Sarah had waited for this moment, knowing it would be the best opportunity to strike. As Michael sank into his favorite chair in the living room, Sarah observed him from the kitchen, her heart pounding but her demeanor calm. The house was quiet, the children were asleep, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. For a brief moment, Sarah stood there, watching him, her emotions a complex swirl of anger, sorrow, and a growing sense of control. Her heart still ached for what Michael had done to her, but now, that pain had been replaced by a chilling resolve. She could almost hear the ticking of a clock in her mind, counting down the seconds until everything would change forever. Michael lazily flipped through the channels on the television, unaware of the quiet footsteps approaching from behind. Sarah had planned this down to the last detail. She knew exactly where he would be sitting, how he would be positioned, and how to make sure that once she took action, there would be no turning back. He wouldn't see it coming. She had studied his movements so thoroughly over the past weeks that she knew precisely when he would let his guard down. He trusted her implicitly, never suspecting that his wife, the woman he thought he could control, had become someone completely different. Sarah moved quietly, almost soundlessly, as she retrieved the weapon she had carefully hidden. It was a kitchen knife, sharp and deadly, an everyday item in her home that would never raise suspicion. She held it in her hand, her fingers wrapped around the handle, her breath shallow but steady. As she neared Michael, she paused for a moment, looking down at the knife. This was it. The moment that would change everything. She wasn't just going to confront him, she was going to make him pay for everything he had done. With one swift motion, Sarah lunged forward, striking him before he had time to react. The shock in his eyes was instantaneous, but it was too late for him to defend himself. The blade sank deep into his flesh, and Michael let out a gasp, his body jerking in surprise. But Sarah didn't stop. She had planned for this to be quick, decisive, and final. She was focused, methodical. She didn't want him to suffer for long, but she wasn't about to show mercy. The anger that had built up inside her over the weeks came rushing to the surface, flooding her mind with a primal need for retribution. The blood spread quickly, staining the floor beneath them. Michael's attempts to speak were cut short as he struggled to breathe, his hand reaching out weakly in an effort to understand what had just happened. But his confusion was short-lived. In a matter of moments, he was gone. For a brief second, Sarah stood still, staring at the lifeless body before her. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction. It was as if her mind had gone completely numb. The reality of what she had just done settled over her like a heavy weight, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had to act fast. The next steps were just as important as the act itself. Sarah calmly cleaned up the scene, methodically erasing any evidence that might point back to her. She moved quickly but with purpose, wiping down every surface, making sure there were no fingerprints, no traces left behind. The knife was cleaned and hidden in a place no one would think to look. The scene had to look like a robbery gone wrong, an attack by an intruder who had escaped without a trace. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how easy it would be to make Michael's murder look like a random act of violence. The hardest part, she thought, would be pretending nothing had happened. But Sarah had always been good at playing a part, at being someone else when the situation demanded it. She would grieve publicly, appearing like the heartbroken wife who had lost everything. No one would suspect that she, the woman who had been so blindsided by Michael's betrayal, was the one responsible for ending his life. The next morning, she woke early, her movements deliberate, her face a mask of sorrow and shock. As she called the police and reported the robbery, Sarah's mind raced, trying to remember every detail of the story she would tell. She was careful, precise, just as she had been with every part of her plan. She would play the grieving widow, the woman who had lost her husband in a violent and senseless crime. It would be perfect. But as the investigation unfolded, Sarah's carefully constructed world began to unravel. There were questions, suspicions, and subtle clues that began to point toward her. The calmness in her eyes, the way she spoke with almost no emotion, the police started to wonder if things were as they seemed. They weren't ready to accuse her yet, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And in the end, it would be that doubt that led to her downfall. The perfect crime was no longer perfect at all.